Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Nitza. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at the State University of New York at New Paltz. And today with my colleague, Andrew O'Meara, also from the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, we're going to be talking about some strategies and some tools that you can use to support the mental health of children in war settings. So as background on that, we've been working, IDMH, the Institute, has been working with the Euchre Help organization for over a year now to try to develop some support infrastructure for the mental health needs of children in the current context in Ukraine. And as a part of that, we've adapted a tool that we had developed here at the Institute, which is a children's book about dealing with difficult situations. And so what we want to do today is give some information and some context about creating trauma-informed environments for children, and then talk specifically about how we can use the book as a tool for supporting children in any environment that they're in an active war setting. So we're going to talk about three learning objectives. We're first going to talk about just making sense of children's reactions to traumatic stress. So identifying what their reactions might be and kind of understanding the context, understanding what those symptoms might mean and where they come from. And then we're going to talk about principles and strategies for creating a trauma-informed environment. So regardless of what this setting is, how to make that setting as healing an environment for children as possible. And then finally, we're going to talk specifically about the use of bibliotherapy with children, and we'll introduce The Unusual Situation, which is a book that we have created here at the Institute. And so we really hope that this information is useful to psychologists, to other mental health professionals, and also to teachers or to anyone else who's working directly with children in this environment. And at the end of the presentation, we'll give you links to some other resources that you can also use to support yourselves in doing this work. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we're first going to talk about understanding and identifying children's reactions to traumatic stress. So traumatic stress is one subset of overall stress. And the reason that we have this image here where trauma is depicted as a subset of stress, but also is depicted as a different shape outside of the circle of stress, is because traumatic incidents are incidents that can leave a different neurological footprint in a child's brain than other types of stressful events. So these events are events that are overwhelming to a child's natural ability to cope or a natural ability to adapt. And as such, the memories of that type of event can be stored in the brain differently than other types of experiences. So what I mean by that is that these memories get coded into the brain in ways that are not like other memories. They are not like narrative memories, like we often have of other types of events. And so instead of being able to tell a linear narrative story about an experience that a child has had when they've experienced something traumatic, it's as if the emotions, the sounds, the sights, and the other physical sensations related to that event get split off and fragmented and lodged into the brain in a different way. So there are these little bits or these little fragments of memory that are unconnected. And when they're encoded that way, when they're encoded as these different little bits of memory, it's as if they are sort of seared or flash frozen into your memory, into a child's memory, in a way that keeps them from being memories of the past. These little bits of memory can become more like live wires, and so they intrude into the present, where they are literally relived or re-experienced. So memories of this event then aren't actual memories, but they're more like re-experiencing of the thing. And those are very different. A re-experiencing of something is very different than having a memory of it from the past. So as long as the traumatic event is not resolved, is not fully processed, the traumatic memories keep intruding into the present moment. The stress hormones that are associated with experiencing something traumatic keep circulating in the body, which can become toxic. And then the emotional responses keep getting replayed or reactivated in the present moment. So I have a picture, an image of what that looks like. So the brain on the left, where the different pieces are fragmented of this puzzle, that's like a traumatic, that's what memories of something traumatic look like in the brain. They're these disconnected fragments or pieces. The brain on the right represents what a memory of a non-traumatic event might look like. It's a coherent, connected memory where the sights and the sounds and the smells and the emotions associated with what happened are connected, and they can tell a story. And so this isn't necessarily a talk about trauma treatment per se, but the goal of trauma treatment is to help people reorganize the traumatic memory so that it's less like the brain on the left and more like the brain on the right. So it becomes a memory of something that happened in the past, not a re-experiencing of it in the present. So children won't necessarily ever forget something bad that happened, but it will become a bad memory of something in the past rather than something that continues to intrude into the present moment. So this is a quote from Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And van der Kolk says, after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. Its energy is focused on suppressing the inner chaos and avoiding new threats at the expense of living in the present moment. And so what he's saying here is that when those memories are in that disconnected, fragmented place, they keep the potential for them to intrude into the present moment is very distressing for people. And so particularly for children. And so children will go to great lengths to try to avoid those triggers, to avoid a re-experiencing where those fragments of memory come back into the present. And so they spend a lot of their emotional, physical, cognitive energy trying to suppress those re-experiencing symptoms from happening. And as such, it makes it harder to be fully present in whatever else they're doing. So I want to talk a little bit more now about how that happens at the level of the brain. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about brain development in children, and then how traumatic memories or traumatic experiences can intrude into brain development for children. So early brain development is shaped by experiences. So our brains develop in a use-dependent manner. That means they are designed to be shaped by whatever environment that we're in, and they're shaped that way. So we are actually born with way more brain cells, neurons, than we will ever have later in life. And the way that our brains get shaped is by the dying off of cells and connections in the brain that aren't used. And so in that way, experience becomes the architect of our brain. Our brains will keep the cells and the connections based on the experiences that we have, the ones that are used, and they will shed the ones that aren't used. So that process begins immediately after birth. And so for that reason, early experiences have a far greater impact on shaping a child's brain than experiences as an adult. Because early experiences are actually creating the neural networks or the memory templates in the brain for later. And so what that means is that when children experience stress as their brains are developing, if that stress is unpredictable, it comes out of the blue and children don't have a sense of being able to control or manage it. If it's severe and it's prolonged or relentless, so children are growing up in a situation in which they are constantly potentially exposed to stress and traumatic stress, their brains are going to develop in a way that creates an increased vulnerability to stressful experiences later in life. Whereas if the stress that they're exposed to is predictable, if it's moderate and not severe, and if it can be controlled or regulated by themselves and or by the people around them, it can create a sense of resilience so that they actually are developing a better sense of being able to manage stress when it comes. And so to the extent possible, even in an unpredictable situation, we want to do our best to create environments for children where the stress feels a little more predictable, where it's not so severe, and to the extent possible that it's controlled or regulated either by themselves or by the people around them. So I use this slide to depict the difference between what happens to a child in one experience of acute traumatic stress versus what happens in an experience of chronic trauma. So acute traumatic stress alters brain function. So temporarily, there's an overwhelming experience in the brain that causes the brain to, causes the cognitive rational part of the brain to go offline and to be hijacked by the emotional response. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But when that happens over time, chronically, if children are exposed to that overwhelming response over and over, it actually starts to alter brain structure. Because the brain then is starting to become wired for that trauma response. So the image here on the left is the brain of a PET scan image of a brain of a child, I believe 3-year-old child who grew up under what we might call normal conditions. And the brain on the right is the child of a 3-year-old who grew up in an experience of extreme neglect and abuse. And as you can see, there are just parts of the brain that just aren't able to be in the brain on the right. There are parts of the brain that just appear to be missing in that image where there's no activity in that part of the brain. And so it's just a demonstration of the ways in which chronic trauma over time actually shapes the structure of a child's brain. And so as I have here on the slide, the chronically traumatized child's template for brain organization is the stress response. And so keeping that in mind as we think about what do we need to do to create environments to try to prevent that from happening. So a little bit more on the brain development piece. This metaphor of a smoke alarm and a watchtower is again the work of Bessel van der Kolk in the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And so he talks about the emotional part of the brain and the rational part of the brain. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but for purposes of today, I want to refer to the emotional part of the brain or the smoke alarm as the back part of the brain. And it's the part of our brain that is designed to monitor our world, our environment for danger and alert us to when there is a potential threat. So it's our brain's warning system. This is a part of the brain that's developing first. And it's, as I just mentioned, it's heavily shaped then by our early experiences. And its job is to monitor among other things, its job is to monitor the world for and identify what is or isn't important to respond to or to attend to for survival purposes. Because it's focused on survival and danger, it has to make quick decisions. It has to, so it's going to over-assume that there's a threat when there isn't one, because that's important from an evolutionary perspective, that's important for keeping us safe. But so this part of the brain then becomes highly prone to false alarms, to identifying identifying a potential danger when there really isn't one. Then the rational part of the brain, or the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex, if you will, this is the part of the brain that's focused on understanding and making meaning of the world around us. So it interprets our experiences and makes meaning of them. And in our metaphor here, van der Kolk refers to this as the watchtower. So it's responsible for interpreting and making meaning of the world around us, of the experiences that we're having. And really important to think about in terms of child development. This is also the part of the brain that regulates our executive functions. And by executive functions, I mean planning, concentration, decision-making. being able to set a goal and sequence a set of actions to get to that goal, or being able to predict the consequences of the actions that we do. And this part of the brain works slower than the emotional part of the brain. It has to take a little bit longer to make accurate meaning or accurately interpret what's happening around us, but it's more fine-tuned, so it's more precise and it's more likely to get it right. So these two parts of the brain, the smoke alarm and the watchtower, work together pretty effectively to manage stress under normal conditions. So how they work together is that the emotional part of the brain, or the smoke alarm, detects a threat, some sort of stressor or threat in the environment that we need to attend to. It alerts the rational part of the brain, or the watchtower, which then examines the potential threat, examines the environment, decides on the level of threat, makes a plan of action, and then executes that plan of action to keep us safe. Once it's done what it needs to do to keep us safe, then it alerts the emotional part of the brain that everything's okay. So then the smoke alarm can reset to its monitoring function, return to baseline, and then it goes about its job of continuing to monitor until it identifies the next threat. So these two parts of the brain working together under normal conditions is a pretty well-designed system, and managing stress relies on this balance and this cooperation between the emotional and the rational parts of our brain. But what happens under conditions of extreme or traumatic stress is that, as I said earlier, traumatic events are those that overwhelm the ability of the brain to be able to cope. And as such, it's as if the smoke alarm gets stuck in the on position. When the smoke alarm in our brain gets stuck in the on position, it overwhelms the ability of the rational part of the brain to do its job. So the smoke alarm gets stuck on, the rational part of our brain goes offline. And then all the brain's attention, and also actually the body's attention, so cognitively, emotionally, physically, all of our attention gets focused on just trying to shut off that smoke alarm at the expense of other brain functions. So in that moment, when the smoke alarm gets stuck on, we lose the ability to do the things that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and regulate the situation. So we temporarily lose the ability to do memory and concentration and focus and planning, and that ability to set a goal to keep ourselves safe, let's say, and then to enact a series of events to make that happen. And so that smoke alarm being stuck in the on position really overwhelms pretty much all the other parts of brain functioning and even physical functioning to some extent. And when that happens, it's highly disturbing to children. It feels very uncomfortable to have that smoke alarm on. Going on, just as if the smoke alarm is going off in one's house. It's a really disturbing experience that doesn't allow you to relax or to focus on other things. And the result of that is that we see children manifest a number of symptoms that you might actually be able to observe: emotional symptoms, cognitive, physical, behavioral, even spiritual symptoms. And so I'm going to quickly talk about each of those next. So when the smoke alarm gets stuck in the on position in the brain, we're overwhelmed. That it's as if the brain and the body are overwhelmed by their emotions. And so one of the things that happens is emotional dysregulation, or children lose the ability to regulate their emotions in the way that they usually do, wherever they're at with that developmentally. And so children their emotions can kind of be all over the place, from really high to really low, which is really distressing for kids when they lose a developmental task that they've already achieved. It's also disturbing to people around them when you watch a child become emotionally dysregulated. Children can feel any emotion too intensely, much more intensely than they usually do. Anger, sadness, fear, shame, guilt. They can become highly irritable. And so really any emotion can be an emotional reaction to traumatic stress, but it's the intensity of that feeling and the loss of the ability to regulate it that become become notable here. I also want to point out that instead of feeling too much, sometimes children develop a response that is a numbing response. So instead of feeling too much, they sort of disconnect or shut off their emotions and numb their emotions as a coping response, which is not a terrible response in the short term, but it becomes a problem long term. And the other problem with the numbing response is that we can't selectively numb. And so if we are numbing an extreme fear reaction, we're also numbing to some extent all our other emotions. And so we're not just controlling the emotion that was troubling, we're muting all of our emotions in that response, which obviously can cause problems over time as well. The other thing I want to say about this is that if you're working with a group of children in a shelter or a classroom or whatever, you will notice more quickly the kids who are feeling too much, if they're dysregulated in a way that is causing them to have really strong, overwhelming emotions. The ones you will be less likely to notice are the ones who are selectively, I'm sorry, not selectively, the ones who are numbing or disconnecting from their emotions, because they won't display the same strength of a reaction that a child who is feeling too much is doing. And so just be sure to monitor and pay attention to kids who don't overtly look like they're having a strong emotional reaction. In terms of cognitive symptoms, one of the things that we see is disruption in normal executive functions. And so what I mean by that is, remember that I said that the rational part of the brain, or the watchtower, is responsible for memory and concentration and focus and planning. So when the smoke alarm in the brain gets stuck in the on position, as I said a second ago, and the rational part of the brain goes offline, or is hijacked or overwhelmed by the emotional response, then we lose the ability to do those things. Temporarily, at least, those things are disrupted. And it's really important to note that these are the things that kids need in order to be able to learn new things. And so kids are going to lose the ability to do schoolwork and that kind of thing, to be able to read and concentrate or learn their math facts or whatever it is they're trying to learn, because their cognitive abilities have been disrupted by the trauma response, the emotional trauma response. We also see that children will can develop a sense of self-blame or guilt and shame around a situation. When kids are looking for an explanation for something bad that has happened, they can, it's often safer internally for children to think about something being their fault than it is to think about the world as being someplace safe or scary, or the adults around them not being trustworthy. So they can, if they don't have an accurate or believable explanation for what's happening, the one that they will develop in their head often will center themselves as the center of the story, in a way that's likely to be irrational, which can then result in a lot of negative beliefs about oneself. So be on the lookout for that. In terms of behavioral symptoms, a lot of the behavioral changes that we see are often a child's attempt to manage that internal chaos that they're experiencing. Like van der Kolk said, when the inner chaos, after a traumatic experience, there's so much inner chaos, and a child's will start to organize themselves around just avoiding that inner chaos or managing it. And so they will attempt to avoid things that might remind them of something bad that happened. And some of this might be conscious choices that a child is making, and they might be able to articulate to you why they're doing what they're doing, but often they won't be able to do that. They will be avoiding these things, but they won't be able to name what's happening or name why they're doing what they're doing. And so they will go to great lengths, both internally and intrapersonally, to try to avoid anything that might make them, that might cause them to have those re-experiencing symptoms. They might also develop interpersonal difficulties. They might have a lack of trust in people. They may become irritable. Sometimes kids try to find something to control. If they can't control what's the world around them, they might try to control things by becoming a bully, being mean to other kids, that type of thing. And then a really important one is a sense of hypervigilance, or a sense of always kind of looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. When kids are exposed to traumatic events over and over, they develop this sense of always being on guard. And so one of the things about creating a trauma-informed environment that we'll talk about in a bit is developing or creating environments to the extent possible where kids can let their guard down a little bit and just feel safe and relax and reset the balance in their brains and reset their nervous systems a little bit. In terms of physical symptoms, a lot of the symptoms associated with the stress hormones circulating in the body, which happens when you've been exposed to something traumatic or deeply stressful, those stress hormones circulating long-term or longer than they were intended to can create a number of symptoms physically, really in any part of the body. So they can have a headache or a tummy ache. Their respiratory system can become impacted, their digestive system. And so related to that is that children often, when they don't have language or words to express what they're feeling, they can express those things through physical symptoms. So somatization, as I'm sure you know, is the manifestation of emotional reactions via physical symptoms. So when kids are somaticizing, they aren't making up the symptom, they're really having the symptom. It's that the issue is that the cause of the symptom is an emotional one, not a physical one. And so be attentive to what physical symptoms kids are communicating to you. Also, another key physical reaction is sleep disturbance. So the sense of hypervigilance that I mentioned a minute ago, also can result in children being unable to sleep or having intrusive dreams, nightmares, that kind of thing. So that hypervigilance and that nervous system being keyed up all the time can impair a child's ability to get good sleep. Children can also have spiritual reactions in terms of, traumatic events really change, especially when they're over time, like the kids in Ukraine are experiencing right now, can really change their view of the world and their beliefs in the world as a safe place or a just place. And so it can impact children's relationship with their God or their higher power. That can happen in a number of ways. Children can sort of double down on their faith and rely on their faith more than they have in the past. Or they might also start to question or be angry at their God around, why are these things happening to me? And so you might say changes in their beliefs, and also in the way that they want to practice or express those beliefs. So now that we've talked about how trauma works at the level of the brain and how that manifests in terms of symptoms that children might display or that you might notice, I want to talk a little bit about influences on the intensity of those reactions or the factors that mediate and moderate a child's reaction. We do know some things about that might be useful to you in thinking about designing trauma-informed environments. So just pointing out that things that I'm sure you've already experienced, but in terms of thinking about the way that war specifically leaves impacts for children, we wanted to think about both the direct and the indirect impact of those things. So obviously there are the experiences of direct harm that children are exposed to, either personally or the things that they're witnessing. The loss of a parent, either through death or through separation, in the multiple ways in which families have been separated, also becomes a key issue for kids. Any other concrete loss or losses, their pets, their belongings, their homes, and then the images and the reminders of the destruction, right? Seeing the destruction in their homes or their neighborhoods or their church or their school. And so limiting those images and reminders as much as possible becomes important. But we also want to think about the indirect impacts that children might experience from the collapse of infrastructure around the loss of, electricity, energy, access to water and food, those kinds of things. The drastic change in children's daily life and their daily routine. And related to that, the other experiences of uncertainty and ambiguity that that children are living with right now. So we know one of the things that we know is that uncertainty and ambiguity really breed anxiety with kids, and that they rely so much on a structure and a routine that's predictable in order to be able to cope. And so those are some things that you might be able to have an impact on, even when you can't control some of the direct impacts with kids. Other abstract losses as well, their loss of a sense of safety in the world, their loss of their belief in the good of people, any sort of other abstract, hard to pin down thing that children might have lost as a result of this. And so, and I want to point out that children may experience these things even if they have been removed from the physical, location of the actual war setting. So changing the physical distance doesn't necessarily change the psychological distance to it. So in whatever setting you're working with children who've been exposed to this war, they may be experiencing some of these symptoms, some of these impacts, some of which they may be able to name and others which they may not be able to name. So one of the things that we talk about with children is that they are vulnerable to the impact of trauma and war in a different way, in a unique way from children for a couple of reasons. So during their exposure to the event itself, they may not as immediately recognize the signs of the threat or be able to make decisions on their own about physically escaping danger. So they become more vulnerable just by being children who aren't as cognitively aware or physically able to take care of themselves. And relatedly, their dependence on other people for their physical safety. Children have a lack of control over what's happening, but also about the ways that they're taken care of or the ways that they are protected. And they don't have the emotional skills yet that adults have in being able to manage their reactions and to cope in a way that adults can cope. After an event is over, children are still dependent on their caregivers for their social and emotional stability. And so to a large extent, children do only as well as the adults around them do, which is an important reason for adults to do the best that they can to take care of themselves. So children become super sensitive to caregivers' own stress. They are watching the adults around them to see how worried they should be, how stressed they should be. And they want to know that their world is still going to be okay and that they're going to be taken care of in the same way that they were before. And when caregivers are struggling and unable to meet the kids' needs, either emotionally or physically, that really has an impact on children. Importantly for our topic today, if the trauma reactions aren't adequately addressed, then some of the symptoms that we've talked about, if those things aren't addressed, they can have a long-term impact on children's overall development. If the stress hormones keep circulating, if they're unable to focus on learning because the cognitive part of their brain has been hijacked, and if they continue to be emotionally dysregulated, that's going to result in interpersonal challenges with kids that will impact their overall development. So we really want to be able to address their emotional and cognitive needs as soon as possible to keep them from having a longer term developmental impact than they have to. And kids also have a lack of life experience to provide context for the current event. So they may not be able to situate the event that's happening now into a longer term timeline, but it sort of seems like this is the whole world all the time. And so they are less able to put an event into an overall time context or an overall lifespan context in the way that adults are. So those are just some of the unique aspects of being a child that put them at risk for negative mental health consequences of being exposed to the war. And then also children are, I think I've mentioned this already, but children are highly reactive to secondary stressors. So it's about what happened to them, what they've been exposed to directly as a part of the war, but also how has the war changed other important aspects of their lives. So as I mentioned, a really important one is what changes have occurred in the ability of their caregivers to be present and to continue to function and to continue to be available to meet their needs. To what extent have they been separated from members of their family? Have they been forced to take on new responsibilities and become little adults in terms of taking care of siblings or taking care of their parents or doing adult level tasks that they weren't asked to do before? What other disruptions have there been in terms of leaving their home, leaving their school, losing their belongings, etc.? And then finally, has the impact of the war chain put them at risk for other exposure to other types of conflict or abuse, or put them in other vulnerable situations? So I think of, what are the risks of being a refugee or being sent away alone to a different location, those kinds of things. What are then those secondary risks that the kids are experiencing? So this slide shows the what we've identified through research as the influences on the intensity of a child's response to exposure to something traumatic, including a war situation. Some of these are things that we don't have any control over. These are just things that children bring with them to the event, like their biological vulnerabilities and their previous life stressors and their previous exposure to trauma. All of those things, as I talked about earlier, can make the brain more sensitive to and more reactive to a traumatic stress in the present. But there are some of these things that we do have control over. And most importantly, I want to point out that the quality of the post-trauma environment and the level of social support that children get or that they perceive themselves to have are big predictors of how well they're going to do in terms of making a recovery. And those are things that we can have a big impact on even as the war is going on. And so we'll talk a lot more about those things. I want to point out here that we know from research that the best predictor of outcome in terms of how well someone is going to do in terms of a mental health recovery following exposure to a traumatic event is the perceived level of social support that they have. So the more someone perceives themselves to have social support, the more likely they are to make a recovery, which is a really important thing to consider, because that is something that any of you that are working with children can offer to a child that can increase the chances that they'll make a full recovery in from a mental health perspective. So just another way of presenting the same information that I just presented. But we know that when children have experienced something difficult, there are 3 key ingredients that influence the intensity of their psychosocial or psychological reaction to the event. And one is the degree to which the event has compromised their support system. Another is the dose of the event that the child has experienced. So how close to the event are they? How long have they been exposed to it? How much have they seen? Those kinds of things. And then what are their recovery resources? So the more resources there are available in the environment to help them recover, the more likely they are to make a recovery. And so while we can't necessarily do anything about the dose of the event that the child has received, we can certainly do some things about their support system and their recovery resources. And so really the next part of the presentation is going to be talking about how to do that, some strategies and principles for doing that. But first, I just want to offer this quick symptom-based informal screening assessment that you can use to sort of triage and identify which children might be most at risk and most in need of individual attention. So this is the work of Chris Bruin and colleagues, and was developed after the London subway bombing back in 2002. And so children can be asked if they've experienced this list of symptoms at least twice in the past week. And children who say yes to more than 6, that's a cutoff point for identifying those that may be in need of additional individual mental health support. So I'll just read you this list: upsetting thoughts or memories, upsetting dreams about the event, acting or feeling as though the event were happening again. So that's that re-experiencing that I was talking about. Feeling upset or experiencing bodily reactions by reminders of the event, difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, heightened awareness of potential dangers to yourself and others. So that's that hypervigilance piece. And then also hypervigilance is being jumpy or being startled at something unexpected. So again, if children say that they've experienced more than six or more of those at least twice in the past week, that's a good informal cutoff point. I want to remind you that it is just an informal assessment and shouldn't be taken as a hard and fast rule. This is just a tool to allow you to try to get a sense of who might need more attention when you're dealing with a lot of kids all at once. Okay, so now that we've covered sort of the background of how trauma impacts children, what we want to spend the next part of this workshop doing is talking about principles and strategies for creating trauma-informed healing environments for children. So what I want to start with is by offering a definition of resilience from a psychological perspective that we're going to then build on as we talk about these principles and strategies. And so resilience has become a bit of a buzzword and gets kind of overused to mean a lot of different things. But the definition that I want to offer you today is that resilience is being able to stay in or to more quickly return to a place of balance in the brain and in the body after we've been disrupted. So as I talked about, when something bad and stressful and traumatic happens, the emotional part of the brain can overwhelm the rational part of the brain. And so in that way, the brain gets tripped out of balance by something traumatic or something extremely stressful. And when that happens, then our brain isn't working in balance to manage our reaction the way that we need it to. And so the definition of resilience is either being not tripped out of balance, which I think is a little unrealistic in the circumstances in Ukraine, but then resilience becomes helping kids build resilience becomes developing the ability to get their brain and then therefore their body back into a state of balance where they're able to manage their reactions effectively when they've been tripped out of balance. So there's a man named Rick Hanson who wrote a book called Resilient, which sort of summarizes all the best science on resilience as we have it so far. And he talks about there being a red zone and a green zone in terms of how you respond to something difficult. And what he calls the red zone is when we react from a place of threat. And so when we're in that place, our body is in what we call its fight or flight mode. Our brain is tripped out of balance. The emotional part of the brain or the smoke alarm is stuck on. And then again, when we're in that place, it disturbs us physically and those stress hormones start to circulate, which means that all of our body and our brain are disturbed. Our immune system, our cardiovascular system, our hormonal system, our digestive system, all the systems of our body are disturbed. And then when we're doing that, we're acting from a place of perceived deficit or perceived disturbance. And so that's what Hanson would call the red zone or a place of reacting. On the other hand, the green zone or responding instead of reacting is dealing with something stressful from a place where the emotional and the rational part of the brain are in balance. And when the emotional and rational part of our brain are in balance, our body then is in its resting state when those stress hormones are continuing to circulate. So our body and our brain are in its place of restoration or refueling. And when we're in that place, we're able to act or respond to something from a sense of perceived safety and stability. And so really, we want to be in a green zone when we're dealing with something difficult. We want to have all our resources about us, emotionally, mentally, and physically to deal with something. But we tend to be, if we're not careful, we tend to respond to things or react to things in that red zone place instead. And so another way of defining resilience then is maintaining the ability to respond versus just react to difficult situations, or to more quickly get into a green zone to deal with something when we've been tripped into a red zone place. So that's the definition of resilience that we're going to work with when we think about how do we help build up kids' ability to deal with difficult things. And so how do we do that? Well, building resilience is like building up any or developing any psychological resource. We do that by having sustained, repeated experiences of that thing that are then turned into durable, long-lasting changes in our brain. So we need to be able to do something repeatedly, have an experience of something repeatedly that strengthens those connections in the brain, or sort of builds up that mental muscle, if you will, to allow those things to stay and to have that access to that thing in the brain quickly when we need it. So it's much like the idea of riding a bicycle. When we first ride a bicycle, we have to really work hard and be really intentional to get all the parts of our body moving in the same way and be able to maintain our balance. But we practice and practice. And when we do that, after a while, we're able to get on the bike and just go and ride without having to be so intentional about thinking about it, because we have this mental muscle built up and these connections in our brain that tell us how to do it without such hard work. And so building resilience is the same thing, as it's similar to the idea of building the skill of riding a bicycle. We need to give children the opportunity to practice it and be successful at it so that they have access to it when they need it. So there are two aspects of building that resilience that we're going to talk about today. And part of it is building up the environment for the children, so that they have an environment that allows them to experience resilience and practice resilience. And then there's also directly targeting building up their personal coping capacity. So this image of a tree here, if we think about building supports in the environment that are trauma informed, where we can think about, letting the roots of a tree develop so that the child is trying to grow and develop in a strong, healthy environment. And then we can think about the branches and the leaves of the tree as building up their own personal coping capacity to deal with difficult things. So now we'll talk a little bit about both of those. So this is some really important information. This came out of a really key paper. If you're not familiar with this, this is the work of Stephen Hupfall and 19 other authors. And in 2007, they got together and summarized the best available science in terms of what do we know about what kids and people in general need in the immediate aftermath of a collective traumatic event. And so they summarized all the available research and all the best available clinical experience of people out there doing the work. And they came up with these 5 principles. And so these 5 principles are the things that we're going to use to build up trauma-informed environments for kids. And those are developing or promoting a sense of safety, a sense of calm, promoting connectedness or a sense of belonging and cohesion amongst people, promoting or reestablishing a sense of efficacy, both in oneself and in one's group, and then the installation of hope. So whatever else you're doing in terms of thinking about how you're working with kids and how you're creating environments that can support and promote their development of resilience and their healing, if you are thinking about these 5 things, then you're on the right track. So now we're going to talk a little bit about each of them in a little more depth. So promoting safety. And the question here, obviously, for working with kids who are in the war setting or in Ukraine right now, it's how do you create a perception of safety in an unsafe environment? And I know that's an ongoing challenge that we don't have a lot of great answers for. But in the setting that you're in, what can you do to create a space that is warm and welcoming? What can you do, and this is a really key one, to create predictable structures and routines? So even if you only have if you're only with the kids for an hour a day, even if you're in a different location every day, if you're moving around because it's unsafe, is there some way that you can create routines and structures that kids can count on in the midst of the chaos? Realistic reassurance, so letting kids know to the extent that you can that they are safe, letting them know that the adults are doing all they can to protect them. And then limiting their exposure to ongoing reminders. So we talked about one of the impacts of war being the constant reminders. And so to the extent that you have control over it, limiting children's exposure to ongoing reminders of the disaster can keep them re-regulated and allow them to feel safe. This is going to be particularly important at points of change or transition. So anytime there's a change in a child's circumstances, regardless of what those circumstances are, this is a time when the need for feeling safe in that point of change or transition becomes really important as well. I think another important thing to think about here is how do you help kids identify between actual danger and danger that is because they're living in this place where they're always on guard and where they're hypervigilant and they're always worried about the next bad thing. So kids who become sensitized and have a lot of triggers that cause them to have a reaction, can you teach them or help them identify what is realistic safety, where are places where they are likely to be safe, and what are actual threats versus their own perceived threats. Closely related to developing safety is promoting a sense of calm. So a basic goal for recovery is to reduce the overactivation of the emotional part of the brain, or deactivate that fight or flight reaction, or deactivate that smoke alarm. Because kids can't recover, A, if they don't feel safe, and B, if they're still in that fight or flight place. When the emotional part of the brain is on, they are just in survival mode, and there's not really a pathway there for the initiation of recovery or healing. And again, when they're in that place, it's interfering with their learning and their memory and their concentration. And it's also just very distressing and uncomfortable for kids. And so one of the things to do is think about how do you promote a goal overall is to help kids develop the flexible use of a variety of coping strategies for soothing themselves in different times and in different situations. So kids need to be in a calm environment, and they need skills to allow themselves to feel calm when they feel dysregulated. So one of the most important ways for adults like you to do that is for you to be able to take care of yourselves and be able to stay calm. When the kids around you are escalated, when the situation is difficult and intense, it's really easy and normal for all of us to also get worked up and to become hypervigilant, but kids will read that. And they will respond to the way that the adults are handling things. And so taking care of yourself kind of becomes job one. And then being able to model that for the kids. And kids will feed off your energy that way. Using soothing strategies like calming music, whatever else you can do in whatever environment you have to create a sense of calm, and then teaching them calming activities. So that leads to the development of a sense of efficacy. Kids need to believe in their own ability to regulate their emotions and calm themselves when they are feeling out of control. So they need to have practiced and learn and be able to believe in a set of strategies for regulating themselves, for soothing themselves, for doing problem solving. They need to develop a sense of autonomy, so belief in their ability to do things on their own. Also related to this is a sense of altruism. So giving kids a chance to help other kids helps develop their belief in their own abilities. And kids need, to the extent that you can, kids need age and context appropriate choices and control. They need to be able to make small decisions and have small wins and have the adults around them trust them and believe in communicate their belief in their ability, their belief in the child's ability, excuse me. So, and these are important developmental tasks for all kids. This isn't just about trauma or just about war, but obviously the setting in Ukraine right now has the potential to strip kids of their natural developmental trajectory for developing efficacy. And so efficacy is also going to help them be able to regulate themselves and be able to develop their own internal sense of calm and safety, like we've talked about. So there's personal efficacy, but there's also collective efficacy. And that's the belief that one's group, and whatever group that is for children, their classroom, their school, their community, is capable of achieving goals or overcoming challenges together. And, Ukraine in itself is doing a great job of I think, displaying a collective belief in one's ability to do this and to win this war. But what can you do in kids' environment to help them develop belief in their own small group and their ability to overcome their challenges that they're facing directly? So so promoting efficacy then is also about reestablishing a sense of control and a sense of self-directedness in a place in which control has been stripped from a lot of people, and a lot of situations, kids can't have the same control that they had before. And if we're not careful, it can also create a sense of helplessness and a sense of hopelessness. And efficacy can really combat those things. And then connectedness. I've already talked about the empirical support for the positive effects of social support. The more social support people perceive themselves to have, the more likely they are to make a full recovery. And so this is about social support and connection, and about sustained connections to attachment figures. You know, the situations like the war tend to disrupt children's connections to other people. School closings, dislocation, you know, being internally displaced, or a refugee in another country, all those things can strip away cohesion and belonging. And so really focusing on those things can have a really clear positive impact. Ways of doing that might include encouraging mutual assistance among children, helping them help each other, which also is going to build the altruism that I talked about a second ago. Cooperative, inclusive activities, and designing tasks that have group goals rather than individual goals. I also want to point out here this sense of universality that can become really healing, that's closely related to connectedness. Kids, adolescents often develop a belief that they are the only one experiencing what they experience. It's some sort of a normal developmental egocentrism that kids have, that they are the sort of center of things and that they are the only one experiencing what they're experiencing. And so there can become a really powerful sense of healing that happens when they realize that they're not alone in that way, that other kids are struggling with the same things that they're struggling with. And so connectedness, cohesion, belonging, and universality are all important related ideas. Just to preview a bit, the children's book that we wrote that we're going to talk about as a tool, developing a sense of universality, or that someone else, in this case, the character in the book, is experiencing something similar to what the child is experiencing, is one tool for doing that as well. The last one is the installation of hope. And this is helping to restore the sense of hopelessness that the war situation or other traumatic events can leave behind. So in doing this, first of all, just promoting the other things that I've talked about so far, the other 4 principles, safety, calm, efficacy, and connectedness, will all contribute to the installation of hope. Also, as I've talked about, the restoration of regular routines, letting kids do things that just feel good, feel enjoyable to them, and any other thing that you can do to create or restore a sense of normalcy into a child's life, even if it's a new normal, something different than the old normal, can really go toward the installation of hope. Also, highlighting, pointing out success, progress, growth in terms of the child, in terms of the group, the family, in multiple layers, pointing out a child's success, progress, and growth can become a way of promoting hope, and helping children stay connected to or reestablish a connection to a future, and their focus on their goals for the future are all some ways of instilling hope. And then I just want to reinforce here at this point the essential role of adult well-being in children's prognosis following war or a similar disaster. So the long-term prognosis for children exposed to war is dependent in large part on the way that the adults around them are doing. They need adults to be psychologically available, to be able to reassure and protect them, and to clarify and interpret and help them make meaning of their experiences in accurate, effective, developmentally appropriate ways. And so this again goes to you taking care of yourself to the best of your ability, prioritizing your own well-being, and also working to support the parents of the kids and teaching parents to be able to do some of the things that we've been talking about today. And I just want to point out here that in some studies, following war or in the middle of war, the best predictor of children's well-being was the level of emotional upset displayed by adults in the child's life. So not that adults have to act tough all the time, because that's not realistic either, but that parents and adults are modeling healthy ways of coping with the difficulty. And then I just want to end this section by talking about the continuity principle. And this is that throughout all the stages of the war cycle, intervention should be aimed at preserving and restoring, to the best of your ability, continuities that have been disrupted as a result of the war. So that may also mean building new continuities, but what can you do to create and highlight and preserve continuities that are predictable and routine for children? So what we just talked about were principles and strategies for developing a trauma-informed environment, or sort of building or creating the root structure for kids, to use this tree metaphor. And now we're going to talk about strategies for helping kids build their own personal coping capacity, or build their own sense of resilience. And much like sort of helping them build the branches and the leaves of the tree. So in terms of thinking about pathways for resilience, we've the two outer circles here represent the things that we've already talked about: the environment that kids are in, the structure, the cultural environment, and the interpersonal environment. But now we're going to talk about the intrapersonal environment. And so this inner circle here is designed to represent that kids' thoughts and their emotions and their behaviors are all interconnected. And so the way that kids think influences how they feel, which influences how they behave. And also the reverse is true. So the way that kids behave can influence the way that they feel, which can influence the self-talk or the thoughts that they have. And the reason that we have this displayed this way here is because this means that you can teach kids strategies in any of these three categories, and it can have an impact on their overall well-being. So some kids will be more responsive to things that deal with thoughts and cognitions. Some are going to be more comfortable dealing in the space of emotions, and some will be more comfortable in the space of behavior-based things. And so really starting from any of those, it's no one set is better than the other. It's about what are the kids likely to be most responsive to. So now I'm just going to talk you through some of the strategies in each of these three categories. So the first one is really from the emotion-based place, and this is about opportunities for kids to identify their emotions. So children may not have words to identify the emotions and the sensations that they experience. As we talked about earlier, helping them do so promotes empowerment and mastery and efficacy. And so if you can help kids identify and build their emotional literacy, or their ability to, or their sort of self-awareness and ability to name and identify what's going on with them, that can go a long way toward promoting overall healing and recovery. So you can do this. These are just examples that we have, but you can do this through activities to help kids name emotions in themselves or others. You can do games like feelings charades, where a child has to act out an emotion and other kids have to guess which emotion they're acting out. You can do any sort of activity that encourages kids to write or draw about how they're feeling today. And there's, you can be as creative as you want in how you do that. You can also help kids identify emotions in characters in stories, and kids are then very easily able to relate or project their own emotions onto characters and vice versa. And so this is really the use of bibliotherapy that my colleague Andrew will be talking about in just a minute. Younger children might better be able to identify physical sensations versus emotions. So you can do activities where you give them the outline of a person and have them identify different colors that relate to where they're feeling different feelings. So maybe use a red crayon to draw somewhere where they're feeling bad in their body. Like maybe they have an upset tummy, so they draw the tummy of the child in red, etc., that kind of a thing. Lots of pathways to doing this, but helping the kids build the skill of identifying their emotions. And just a reminder here that children should be invited, children can be encouraged to share and to talk about these things, but they shouldn't ever be forced to do so. There's something important about being able to trust a child's timeline and their judgment for when they're ready to do certain things. So you may have to invite a child multiple times to do something before they're really ready to do that. Related to identifying emotions is opportunities for self-expression. So kids need an opportunity to be able to tell their story. And when they are able to sort of tell their story, talk about their experiences, express what's going on inside of them, it's helpful to them in multiple ways. And this is one of the ways. Earlier in the presentation, I had the picture of a brain that was all the disconnected pieces inside the brain, little parts of memory. And then I had a brain where the pieces are all connected to each other. And I talked about how the goal of sort of trauma therapy is to help kids go from the disconnected memories and pieces into more of a narrative story. And so even though this isn't a talk about therapy per se, every chance that a kid gets to tell their story and to express what's going on with them is going to be a step in that process of helping them rework the memory into something that is a cohesive narrative. And they may need to do that multiple times. Children like to do this by playing in the sand, playing out characters in the sand that represent what they're going through. And one of the ways that you can tell that this is working or that children are making progress is that the bad guy starts to lose in the end instead of win. Children are sort of start to take mastery over the story and change the story so that the good guy wins, that kind of a thing. In addition to playing puppets, they can do journaling, they can do poetry, they can do drawing or singing or dancing, whatever their comfortable mode of self-expression is what's important here. And so this, giving kids options and letting them choose which option they want to participate in also is another way of establishing efficacy by giving kids choice and control. And then linking this to the idea of cohesion and belonging and universality, you can create opportunities for children to share their work and their creations or their thoughts or their stories with other people. Again, this should always be voluntary, but when kids do this, then you're creating connections amongst kids in addition to that self-expression piece. Another key skill here, and this is not necessarily a skill for the kids, but a skill for you to apply when working with the kids, is validating their emotions and thoughts. Validating kids' emotions and thoughts is going to go a long way to helping them identify and own their own experiences and then be able to initiate the healing process for them. So children, all of us, benefit from having our experiences and our thoughts and our feelings heard and validated by another human being, even if there's nothing that can be done to fix them. So when you're listening to children, I know sometimes our inclination as adults is just to immediately try to fix or try to problem solve. But one of the ways that we can promote resilience and coping amongst kids is to listen, to reflect back what we hear them say, but then encourage them to identify ways that they might be able to address the problem themselves. So you can use phrases. We just have some little sentence stems here that are phrases that you can use when you're reflecting empathy back to a child. So you can say something like, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling scared and you're really feeling sad because you miss your dad. And just stop there. That's just an example, but just listening for the feelings, the thoughts, the experiences, the feelings, and the thoughts, and then acting as a mirror and reflecting that back to them. That is an incredibly powerful start to a healing process. Sometimes people are hesitant, especially around naming feelings, because they're concerned that they're going to get it wrong. So I might say, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling sad that because you miss your dad. And a child might say back, actually, I'm not sad. I'm more angry that he had to go away in the first place. Okay, so by me saying sad and the child clarifying that it actually isn't sadness that he's feeling, but anger, now that's done a lot of good things. The child has clarified for themselves what their feeling is, which is the most important, but they've also experienced my connection and my attempt to help them. And their clarification has helped both them and me. So it's okay to get the feeling wrong. If you name a feeling and a child, that's not quite the right feeling that the child is experiencing, that clarification can be okay. So here are some things that we often do when we talk to kids, or when we talk to other people to try to reassure them. But these are some things that end up potentially feeling invalidating or dismissive, even though your attempt is to be validating. So telling kids don't feel bad, or don't cry, or don't worry. Telling someone not to feel what they're feeling doesn't work. Rarely does that work. And so when you tell someone not to feel what they're feeling, even though it's an attempt to help them feel better, often it helps them feel worse, because now they've gotten the message that there's something wrong with the way that they're feeling. And we don't want kids to think that there's something wrong with what they're feeling. We want them and us to accept and acknowledge what they're feeling without trying to change or fix it. So a related one is try not to think about it, or let's talk about something else. That's an attempt to change the subject. And it's often because we as adults don't know how to sit with the child's pain, or it's uncomfortable for us, and we want them to be thinking about something less painful. But again, we can trust a child's process on this. And so when we tell them not to think about it or to think about something else, we're sending them the message that their process is wrong. And also maybe that we aren't able or willing to hear what they have to say. So we want to avoid those things. Saying to a child, I know how you feel. This isn't terrible, but a terrible thing to say, but you may or may not actually know how they feel. And so sometimes when you say, I know how you feel, a person will say back, how could you possibly know how I feel? Have you lost your father in the war? As an example. And so instead of saying, I know how you feel, a better option is to say, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling sad. Something to show them that you know how they feel by telling them, by reflecting back how they are feeling, instead of just saying, I know how you feel. That next one, it's God's will, or any reference to God in these situations. Just be really careful with these things. Unless you are ordained to interpret God's meaning for people, especially for children, just be really careful with these things, because the traumatic events and war really stir kids up in terms of their beliefs and what they've been taught. And we don't want to, unless we are trained to do so, we don't want to interfere with that process. The others on here, it could be worse, or at least you still have your dog, or at least you still have your home, or anything that starts with the phrase at least. Usually the rule here is if you're going to say something that starts with the phrase at least, probably don't say it. And the reason I say that is because when you say, well, at least you still have this, you're sort of dismissing what the child is feeling. It's an attempt at a reframe, right? It's an attempt to try to help the child focus on the positive aspects of an experience, but it's also it's dismissing the child's pain by trying to get them to focus on something else. And so really holding off on those attempts to help the child focus on something else until they really have indicated themselves that they're ready to move on. So all these phrases, again, they're well-intended. They're attempts to help kids feel better, but they often end up feeling dismissing or invalidating to the child and communicating the message that there's something wrong with the way that they're feeling or what they're saying. And so the better option is to really just stick with empathy, reflecting back what you hear a child say, and then encouraging them to try to think about things they might want to do. Okay, so the third strategy is helping kids build a toolbox of good coping skills or strategies for building resilience. What we want is for kids to have a range of skills that they can use to fit different situations. So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about cognitive processing of this in terms of cognitive skills, I guess, around dealing with traumatic events is just helping kids learn to distinguish between the parts of a situation they have control over and the parts of the situation that they don't have control over. And this is super important because when we try to have control over something that we don't have control over, that is just an unending sort of crazy making process where we're sort of, metaphorically beating our heads against a wall. And so we want to help kids identify if there are parts of the situation that they do have some control over or some ability to change, We want to help them be able to identify to use some problem solving skills to be able to identify what is it that they want to do to effect that change. But we also want to help them then for the parts of the situation that they don't have any control over externally. Ideally, we always do have control over our own internal reactions to those things. So in situations in low control situations where kids don't have a lot of control over the outcome or the situation, we can help them learn and develop emotion regulation skills for coping with something that they can't change. And so being able to distinguish between the things they can change and the situations that they don't have a lot of control over becomes a skill and a cognitive skill in and of itself. And then having them practice and practice and practice so that they have confidence in their ability to use these skills in a crisis when they need them. When you're in a situation of having already been triggered into a red zone place, it's almost too late to develop a new coping skill because we can't learn something new when our brains are in that triggered smoke alarm place. And so we want to teach kids these tools so they have them in their toolbox. They have belief in their own ability to use them so that when they need them, they know that they're already there and they can become almost automatic, like getting on a bike and riding it once you've already learned how to ride. Just a few strategies here. One is that these are tools that you can help kids put in their toolbox. And one is any type of relaxation exercise. So relaxation exercises help kids focus on their breath and their body and regulate their respiratory system, which will then help regulate their nervous system and all their other systems. So, and by focusing and taking control over their breathing and their muscles, they learn to then control their anxiety and other overwhelming feelings. And also just being able to physically relax, help kids return to that. It's using your body and your breath to tell your brain that everything is okay so that the brain and can get back into balance and the rational part of your brain can go back online and then they can return to the process of learning if they're in a setting in which they need to be learning. So any sort of relaxation process here. Again, the idea is it's having the body communicate back to the brain that everything is okay, which will reduce the hypervigilance, the anxiety, and allow kids to develop a sense of control over their internal experience. Closely related to relaxation strategies are mindfulness strategies. So mindfulness strategies help kids keep their awareness in the present moment and reduce their overwhelming emotions about things in the past or things in the future. So anxiety, fear, stress, anger, those are all tend to be things that kids are thinking about and focusing on, maybe obsessing about something that has already happened or their fear of something that might happen. And so mindfulness is helping kids developing the skill of returning to the present moment and just focusing on what's happening in the present, which promotes self-regulation and well-being in lots of ways. If you teach kids to do this regularly, or if you have kids practice this regularly, it really can start to reduce their symptoms and also, again, build their sense of efficacy and their belief in their ability to control their own internal experience. There's a lot of research about this, and with kids, I think this is such a strong finding. A daily 2-minute mindfulness exercise, 2 minutes a day, is enough to see some really good improvements in memory, self-esteem, compassion for other people, also in terms of academic performance. And so helping kids develop and be able to use this tool is a really incredible gift you can give to them. Oops. And examples of other coping strategies, other things that we can help kids develop to put into their toolbox are identifying people that they trust and being able to talk to them, learning to share, developing the vocabulary and the willingness to be able to tell their story to someone that they trust. Physical exercise, physical movement is great for helping the brain reset once it's been triggered into a red zone place. Positive, distracting, enjoyable activities, sports, hobbies, reading. Sometimes kids will need to do some mindfulness or some relaxation to be able to get into reading, but that can certainly be helpful. I want to say quickly a word about distraction. Kids being able to distract themselves in the short term when something bad is happening and they don't have any other choice is a really good strategy. But I just want to caution that distraction is not a super good long-term strategy. So we need kids to have the ability to distract themselves when there's nothing else, but we also need to help them have activities for doing a deeper level of processing and expression beyond just distraction. Keeping a journal, writing every day has some really, there's some good science around that. Creative expression, we've already talked about self-expression, but dancing, singing, playing, writing, anything that allows them to be creative and express themselves. Maintaining a schedule. We've talked about the importance of predictability and routine and continuity for kids. So helping them develop their own schedule, perhaps, and then working with them to be able to achieve that schedule or to work through that schedule can become really important. And then any other activity that they can engage in that promotes meaning. Kids can, there's a saying that we can tolerate a lot of what if we know the why. And so helping kids do things that give themselves a sense of meaning or purpose goes a long way toward accomplishing the goals that we've been talking about today. So that is the end of section 2. And now we're going to turn to section 3 about bibliotherapy using the book, the tool that we've created here at our institute as an example. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew O'Meara, for that section.
All right, so thank you, Amy. So as she just mentioned, in this next section, we're going to go over bibliotherapy. Also, we're going to cover the book An Unusual Situation, which Amy at the beginning of the presentation had mentioned. This was a resource that we created here at our institute to sort of hit on these different strategies, right? These 3 different strategies for building resiliency. So a little bit about bibliotherapy. So this is a technique to engage children with these different resilience strategies through the use of literature. I know earlier we talked a little bit about the continuity principle, but children already tend to do this, right? They already tend to engage with literature. They engage with storybooks, either chapter books for older kids, picture books for younger kids, as a way to understand the world and also as a way to help them process their own emotions. So this is something that children are doing on their own, even pre-event. So if we're able to bring in these strategies through using literature post-event, they'll be able to sort of have some continuity there of being able to use strategies that they used previously. So the idea here is that by identifying with the characters in the story, children can learn about themselves vicariously through the struggles of the character. So essentially, they see the character going through different struggles that are similar to the struggles that they are going through. They see the character having similar experiences to the experiences that they are having. And then they also get to see the character figure out ways to overcome those experiences, to be able to build resilience in face of those experiences. So this helps the children to recognize that they're not alone in those experiences, right? There are other people out there who face similar experiences, who have similar challenges that they do. Those people are able to find strategies to help themselves. These kind of techniques, bibliotherapy techniques, can also help children to learn that there are multiple ways to cope with what they're feeling, right? There's not always one prescribed intervention for certain types of feelings, right? Different people have different things that work for them. And so this really shows that, if there's something that child has used previously that hasn't been working, maybe there's other strategies that could work. And this, through bibliotherapy, they're able to see those techniques that the characters are using, which might not be techniques that they're familiar with. Bibliotherapy can also be effectively used individually with individual children or in small groups. If you sort of think of kindergarten or first grade story time, right? You can definitely use these techniques, lead a story time with a group of children and then lead a discussion afterwards, right? Or this can be used individually, working one-on-one with a child. So the resource that our institute created was called An Unusual Situation. We'll get into a little bit about what that specific book looks like in just a second, but I did want to lay out the different resources that we developed around this book. So the first one was our storybook titled An Unusual Situation. This is a pretty traditional picture book. It's about 20 pages long, and this is really useful to help kids identify with the character, introduce the concepts to children about identifying your emotions, coming up with coping skills, how to share those emotions with others around you. For instance, the character in the book, Milo, he starts to experience some really distressing symptoms based on his unusual situation, and he's able to identify what those feelings are, communicate those with his parents, and then come up with some resilience, with some strategies to help them all build resilience together. So this is really a great way to have kids start to engage with the concepts around identifying what they're going through and how they can start building different coping skills. And again, children can read this either alone, or this can be used in a group reading setting. From that original storybook, we also developed a coloring book. Content-wise, this is almost exactly the same as the storybook, but it is in black and white instead of being in full color. So this allows children to color in the book for added interactivity. This could also be useful for younger children who might not be able to engage with the content of the book on an individual basis as much. So for instance, leading a story time for children who can't read themselves, while those children color the pictures in the book, right? They're still engaging with the content, but they're also hearing the words, they're hearing their teacher, their parent, the adult in the room communicate these ideas to them. And then the third resource that our institute created is the Unusual Situation Workbook. This is a book of around 9 structured activities, and we will have more structured activities to come in another version. But these are activities for children to be able to engage individually with the concepts, both from the storybook and coloring book, as well as those 3 different strategies that we talked about before. So this allows children to engage in the expression and building of coping strategies themselves. So this is sort of a step above just identifying with the character and identifying with what the character has been going through, but sort of brings that one step further of saying, compare yourself with the character. What are some of the things the character has been going through? What are some of the things that the child has been going through? How is the character handling it? What are some ways that you can handle it? So this is really, really a way for us to drill down on that emotion identification, self-expression, and building of coping skills. So those are the 3 resources that we have. I'm going to go over a little bit on specifically the storybook and the workbook. Like I said, the coloring book is the same content-wise as the storybook. So now we're going to take some time to look at how we're showing these different challenges to the kids in the storybook, and then how we're identifying strategies in the workbook, and then linking the 2 together. So a little bit of background on the book, An Unusual Situation. So the main character, whose name is Milo, we did change that name of the character to Tepek for the Ukrainian version. So you'll see that listed in the photos here. But Milo, the bird here, is dealing with an unusual situation affecting him and his family. We don't identify the situation specifically in the book, so we don't actually name what that situation is. That was purposeful so that we're able to use the book in different settings for different types of unusual situations. So it is usable in different types of scenarios. And Milo, when we were developing this resource, we did go back and forth on how we wanted to depict Milo, right? What kind of character did we want them to be? So we decided to go with a bird. Birds are recognizable to children around the world. Almost every culture has birds. Every part of the world has birds. And so this is a way for kids from different parts of the world to be able to identify with Milo as a character. If we picked a specific character from a specific part of the world, for instance, that could be hard for other kids to be able to identify with, to be able to see themselves in the character. So by using an animal character, the children are a little bit more able to project themselves onto that character. So the first skill we're going to talk about here is identifying emotions. So I believe Amy said this before, but children can find it very difficult to both identify those emotions that they're feeling for themselves and to accurately communicate what those emotions are to those around them. This is especially true when they're distressed, right? When you're thrown into that red zone, especially for kids, when they're thrown into that red zone, it's really hard for them to re-regulate themselves and to figure out, what do I actually need right now? What am I feeling, and how do I communicate that to the other, to my parent, to another trusted adult? So when they're in that red zone, it can be really hard for them to identify. Providing them some assistance in knowing how they can cope, knowing what feelings they can feel, knowing what adults to go to, can also not only help the kids know their emotions and to be able to identify what their feelings are, but then to better communicate that to the adults around them so that we can best help those children. So with the skill of identifying emotions, what we really want to do here is help children identify and label their emotions. And this will help them to be more aware of those emotions, when they come up, how they feel for them, where they feel those feelings in their body. It will help them to gain a sense of mastery and control over those feelings, right? So like Amy said, once we understand the why, the what becomes a lot easier. And to develop a sense of confidence, efficacy, and empowerment, right? By being able to understand those emotions, by being able to name them, to identify them, and to be able to do that in the moment when they come up, can give us that sense of confidence and ability over those emotions. So here you see, this is a picture here from the storybook. Milo, through a couple different pages in the book, expresses a couple different emotions that he's having. There's some difficulty with him being able to identify what those emotions are, where those emotions are coming from, how they're connected. So as you can see here, you know, the idea is that it's not uncommon for children to find it difficult to identify their emotions and to find it difficult to know what they're feeling. Here's some pictures from the workbook. So like I said, in the story, Milo expresses a wide range of emotions, and these allow the children to be able to identify with that character. However, in order to bring that into the individual child, right, it can be difficult for them to identify those emotions. So giving them some kind of list or having them create a list of their emotions can be an effective way to sort of get them to narrow down what they might be feeling. So here are 2 pages from our workbook. The page on the left here, page 4, is actually a double-sided page. So there is another page with other emotion words here. And essentially it asks the children to identify what emotions Milo has been feeling in the story. And then on the next page, it asks them to identify the emotions that they've been feeling related to their unusual situation. So again, really trying to identify with Milo, have the child identify with Milo, and then also have the child identify those emotions in themselves. And then over here on the other page, it asks them to identify some of the emotions that they like to feel, some of the emotions that they don't like to feel. So sort of drilling down on those, on what those emotions are, being able to categorize those emotions so that children can look at that list and say, you know, which side of the list is this emotion on? Is this an emotion I like to feel? Is this an emotion I don't like to feel? That can also give them some sense of, you know, if they're having trouble with that identifying that emotion, of saying, is it an emotion that feels good or bad? And then being able to sort of go down that list. So the next skill I wanted to touch on here is the skill of self-expression. So through self-expression, children are able to sort of be the masters of their own story, their own storytellers. So instead of just being able to sort of report what happened to them, they're able to sort of gain mastery, gain control over their own story, and be able to tell it in the way that feels comfortable and confident for themselves. Again, this is something that children do related to the continuity principle. This is something that children do even before an unusual situation happens, right? Children oftentimes act things out through playing, drawing, writing, right? It helps them to sort of integrate these experiences that they have throughout their days into their lives into a really healthy way. And this has been demonstrated to reduce emotional distress related to these events. So if they're able to act these events out in play, they're able to control it, right? They're able to control when things happen, where things happen, which can allow them to sort of be able to piece that story back together in a way that makes sense to them. So the book mentions playing games, drawing, dancing, writing as different expression activities. So like I had said previously, right, Milo's facing all of these challenges. He's having all of these things happen to him, all of these feelings that are really confusing for him. And so what he's able to do is communicate that to his parents and to his sister. And together they're able to come up with some activities that Milo can do on his own, like playing, dancing, writing, or drawing. Also some activities that they can do as a family, playing board games, for instance, talking things through. So it sort of, the purpose here is to have kids identify with the character and to say, if you're having these kind of issues, if you're having a hard time with these feelings, one way that you might be able to gain some mastery and some control over that is through this sort of self-expression. And then in the workbook, children are invited to engage with the book by drawing and writing about Milo's experience and or about their own experiences. So over here in the workbook, the first couple of pages really hit on this expression, right? Drawing, writing, drawing a picture, writing a little story about what Milo's gone through, about what they've gone through. And this can change in specifics depending on the age of the child, how much the child is able to engage with things. For younger children, it might make more sense to do more drawing activities. They might not have the language to express their feelings. Whereas with older children, they might prefer the language, they might prefer using different words and being able to play with different words related to how they've been feeling and their own story. And the last skill here is to develop coping strategies. So children need to be able to identify and develop these coping skills to deal with the situations that they don't have control over, right? Like Amy had said, we don't necessarily always have control over the situation, but we do have control over the ways that we feel about it. And so if we're able to come up with different strategies, different coping skills to be able to help us alter the way that we're feeling to feel a way that we would like to feel, we can do that here. So the book offers some examples of how Milo is able to engage in coping strategies, how he's able to engage with both himself internally and with his family and his parents and his sister externally in order to help to develop some of those coping strategies. So children can learn from Milo's experience, and then they can be assisted in generating and practicing some of their own coping strategies. So over here on page 13, this is from the storybook. We see Milo engaging in some of those coping strategies, like I said, you know, the playing of board games. And then here in the workbook, we have some activities here to help children to identify some coping strategies, things that they enjoy doing, things that make them feel better. So over here on page 8, it asks them to, you know, here's a space below, write some things that make you feel better, draw some things that make you feel better. What are some ways that you can feel better? Over here on page 9 on the right, this is a list. So generate a list of things that make you feel better, right? It feels good when I blank. The reason we want to do this is because what the research shows is that the best way to build resilience with coping strategies is to develop multiple different kinds of coping strategies, so that no matter what where that child is or what the environment will allow them to do, they have something that they can do, right? So whether this be emotional coping strategies, behavioral coping strategies, cognitive coping strategies, having something in each of those categories so that you can sort of pull it out of your tool belt when the need arises is the best practice. So by working with children to develop multiple different coping skills, that allows them to be able to go to those skills, even if one of them they're not able to do, right? If one of their coping skills is to go and talk with a family member. Well, what if they're in school and they don't have a family member available, right? Is there certain ways that they can pull out some of these other coping skills that they've developed so that they can re-regulate themselves and then use that appropriate coping skill when the time is right. Also, something to note here is that using the emotions that the child had identified previously in the workbook can be a really good way to know what kind of coping skills children need, right? What are the feelings that make them feel bad? What are the things that make them feel bad? What are those bad feelings? And what are those good feelings, right? What are some things that you can do to make those good feelings happen? What are some things that that come before those bad feelings? So there's different ways that you can use those the things that they've identified to know what kind of coping strategies would work for that child. And then just to finish out, here are some resources that our institute have developed that you are more than welcome to use. So both the storybook, the coloring book, and the workbook are available for free on our website. If you click on this link, it will take you directly to a short survey. Just fill out the short survey about who you are, who your organization is, what your intended use of the book is, and then you can download that book for free. We have it available in multiple different languages, including English, Spanish, French, Russian, Ukrainian, and Haitian Creole, with more to come. We also do have some tip sheets on various aspects of coping with stress available on our website at newpaltz.edu/IDMH. We also have a YouTube video library, which includes other recorded trainings, webcasts, different trainings we've done, PFA examples. So if you go to YouTube and you type in IDMH, or the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, you can find that. You can also find that from our website. Again, newpaltz.edu/IDMH should be under the resources tab. And if there's anything else that you need from us, any questions that you would like to follow up with us about, please do keep in touch. Reach out to us. Best way is via email. So Amy and I's personal emails are here, as well as the email for our institute in general. So if you email any of these three, you can get in touch with us. If there's anything else anyone else needs, please do let us know. And thank you.